want to tell you about our next open micer who is named Nick Newlin. Give it up for Nick Newlin. And you don't have to come up yet till we fix. I did that out of sequence, anyway. But he is in a Capitol Fringe Festival show named Cabaret Cuckoo. There are probably a few shows left, which you can find out at capfringe.org. And he juggles accordions. He plays and juggles the accordion. It's amazing. You've never seen anything like it. It's a great show. We good? All right. You ready to take a chance? All right. Give it a big round of applause, Nick Newlin.
Thank you. Big hand for Tejan, sound man. In 1966, while the Vietnam War raged overseas and people protested for peace at home, my parents loaded my older brother, my younger sister, and me into a VW bus with peace signs and flower power stickers on it and drove us down to Guatemala City, Guatemala, where we would live for the next 2 years. I was 7 years old and going into the 2nd grade. My parents were not hippies or draft dodgers. My dad was a diplomat, a foreign service officer working for the State Department. My mom was a school teacher. But they were anti-war and pro-peace. And before going to Guatemala, I went to a Quaker school in Washington, D.C., lower school at Sidwell Friends, now famous for the Obama children. If you got into a fight at Sidwell Friends School, you would immediately go to the principal's office. Not so at my new school in Guatemala, Valle Verde, where playground fighting was a way of life. Blows to the head and body. It was barbaric. I chose not to participate. I was an elementary school conscientious objector. But one day, my 2nd grade teacher, an odd woman from England named Mrs. Pinkney, pulled me aside and said, "Nicky, why aren't you fighting like the other boys?" I had no good answer for her. And so I determined that in order to fit in at Valle Verde, I would have to learn to fight. It's not like I had never fought before. In fact, during that era, I fought regularly with my brother Bill, my older brother. Sibling rivalry, competitiveness, boy stuff. But our fights were Quaker-style fights. Wrestling followed by peace negotiations. Our fights would always end with one or the other of us in a headlock until we could hammer out a truce. And it gave us time to catch up with each other. You know, quality time, Quaker style. But what came out of that was the idea of the headlock. It seemed like a foolproof way for me to get into the fight club at Valle Verde. I decided I was going to challenge Alejandro Camacho to a fight. I ran this by my best friend, Norman Whitehead, who, as the name suggests, was a blonde-haired American kid. Norman was a sensitive and sensible and nervous boy, and he did not think it was a good idea. And it wasn't, for 3 reasons. 1, Alejandro Camacho was the biggest kid in the class. 2, I was one of the smaller kids in the class. And 3, and had I had a better vocabulary, I would have realized this. Alejandro Camacho had the word macho embedded into his name. Norman Whitehead, always good with a poetical metaphor, said to me, "Nicky, have you ever looked at Alejandro Camacho? His arms look like baseball bats." I ignored his advice stubbornly and went on with my plan. And one brave day, I decided that was the day I was going to challenge Alejandro Camacho to a fight. I looked over at him on the playground and saw him surrounded by his entourage, as usual, laughing and roughhousing. and I slowly started to walk towards him, going over the plan in my head. I would challenge him to the fight. He would swing. I would elude him. I was fast. He would swing. I would duck. I would tire him out. Then I would get him into the headlock. That was as far as my plan went. I figured that was as far as it needed to go. And maybe afterwards I would have my own entourage. I hadn't really worked it all out. And as I got closer to Alejandro, I noticed that Norman Whitehead was right. His arms did look like baseball bats. It was freaky. And his legs looked like tree trunks. But the worst of it was his height. He was fully 1 foot taller than I was. If I were to get him into a headlock, I would have to leap up to get to his neck or climb up him. My foolproof plan was starting to show some holes, but there was no turning back. I finally got up to Alejandro Camacho, and I looked up at him and said in my biggest Spanish voice, "Quiero pelearte. I want to fight you." He looked down at me, looked at his friends, sneered, and we squared off. Alejandro Camacho hit me hard in the stomach, knocking the wind out of me, and I fell to the ground gasping for breath. A crowd started to gather. I thought I heard ambulance sounds, which was odd. Could the medical system in Guatemala really be that efficient? Turns out it was Norman Whitehead making ambulance sounds with his mouth. He pushed his way into the center of the crowd and grabbed me by my arms and dragged me out of the circle to safety. Needless to say, I did not join the fight club at Valle Verde. However, ironically enough, I did gain some schoolyard cred just because by challenging Alejandro Camacho to a fight, by me challenging him to a fight, I had either exhibited a memorable degree of insanity or cojones. And the next 2 years at Valle Verde were fine. I hung out with my pacifist friends. Everybody was in their places. And when I went back to DC a few years later, I learned cross-country running as a sport. And I never got into another fight again. But I've always made it a point to keep a good friend like Norman Whitehead around me at all times, just in case. Thank you.
You'll always be a winner to us, Nick.